Welcome to today's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be made available and posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP board member Lee Cullum.
Good morning and good early afternoon. Very happy to be with all of you, and especially happy to be here with Dr. Greg Treverton. He was the chair of the National Intelligence Council in the last couple of years of the Obama administration, is now at the University of Southern California, where he's a professor of the practice of international relations. He's taught at Harvard, he's taught at Columbia, he's held major positions at the RAND Corporation. He is, in fact, giving his life to the defense and security of this nation. Greg, it's really nice to connect with you again.
It's my pleasure, Lee. It's great to see you.
We are talking about the Global Trends Report 2021, which has just come out. But of course, when you were in Washington, you presided over the production of that report for 2017. And it must be an enormous undertaking. You deal with people in all stations of life all over the world. How do you make it happen?
It is a big undertaking. It's something that occupies a good chunk of one of our sort of long-term analysis staff for a couple of years. Basically, in doing the one that released in 2017, we must have reached out. I think we touched in one way or another some 2,000 people around the world. We had focus groups of students in Mexico City, of entrepreneurs in Bangalore, of women's groups in lots of different places. And we obviously talked to the think tanks and to government officials. But in some, we were in, I think, 35 countries altogether. So we were on site in lots of places, trying to really talk to the obvious people, the officials and think tank folks, but also to try and get some sense of the social underpinnings of things that were going on in various parts of the world. So it is but it's become a good brand for the NIC, for the National Intelligence Council, and I think a very useful document, I hope.
Well, of course, they touch on all kinds of issues that face us at the moment, including technology. And the American Security Project has just issued an open letter urging American leaders to lead in the area of exponential technologies. And I was interested to note in this report, Greg, that what is foreseen, perhaps, is an intense rivalry between science and technology people in government and science and technology people outside government, and that it could undermine security. I asked somebody yesterday what this might mean, and his thought, well, maybe it's a Silicon Valley reluctance to be involved in security matters. What do you think?
Well, there has been, as you know, over the past few years, some reluctance. Google was sort of bowing at one point to its employees who thought do no harm should be their motto. Others in Silicon Valley, though, the Microsoft and the Cisco's in particular, they've been, I think, quite prepared to work with the government. Jeff Bezos points out that most things in technology can either be used for good or ill. And so working on them is not necessarily, it's the use we care about, not working on them. So in some, I think on the whole, there's been some movement. There's still obviously some tension between the two, but there has been, I think, some movement in the direction of saying, well, let's work on these technologies, and then we'll be trying to be very careful about their particular use. And we know that something that AI that processes images for a drone can also help do logistics in a factory, right? So the technologies are relatively neutral. And I think there has been some progress in that dialogue between Silicon Valley and the government, particularly the Defense Department, which is sort of the cutting edge of the issue.
So maybe this rivalry can be harmonized, and do no evil. Don't be evil. Is that what I heard somebody say at one point?
Yes, that was the Google employee motto. Yes,
I think so. When you were at the Atlantic Council, you've done things for the Atlantic Council, and 3 years ago you co-authored a report. It was really written by three of you on something that the Global Trends deals with also, and it's the mismatch between government and the people that governments think that they're trying to govern. The governments just can't deliver what is wanted and what is needed by their citizens. And so this Global Trends report foresees perhaps alternative forms of government, new ways of governance, where you called for new institutions or renewed institutions. What do you think might develop to fill this gap that seems to be growing?
It does seem to be a gap, and I think it is growing. On the one hand, we have the technologies that empower people, let them make their claims, sometimes spurious, but often legitimate. On the one hand, on the other hand, we see governments that are less and less able to fulfill those needs. So I think we will see maybe even dramatic new forms of what we now think of as public-private partnership. I tend to think in 20 years, we'll think that even our use of the words public and private in that sense is quaint. It will take new forms of governance we haven't, I think, yet conceived. We see some of the glimmers as some transit authorities reach out to the Ubers and Lyfts, but I think we will see a whole new set of governance forms, particularly bridging public and private, but also bridging levels of government. As we saw in the pandemic, much of the leadership, such as it was in the United States, was from mayors and governors, not the federal government. So I think we'll see new kinds of partnerships that we haven't even conceived of yet. And I think that's a real value of the global trends, trying to at least put a marker down as something that's really very important out there to happen.
Yes, and perhaps help it to happen. We seem to need it pretty quickly. Of course, climate change looms large in this report, as undoubtedly it did in yours. And there is one tucked away in one paragraph is the possible demand for reengineering or the possible turning to reengineering. Elizabeth Colbert wrote a book about this early last year called Under a White Sky. You're probably familiar with it. There's a program at Harvard that would involve shooting diamond dust into the atmosphere, maybe even the stratosphere. It would form a cloud over the world, a white sky, and heat would be deflected outward, not down on us. It can cause problems if it's ever reversed. Do you think it's something that will seriously be considered?
I think so, yes. And for a long time, climate engineering or geoengineering was a kind of a dirty word because people feared if you could do that, then you wouldn't do the things now to reduce the carbon emissions. But on our current track, we're just not going to be able to solve this problem, I think, without some climate engineering, as spraying into the stratosphere is probably the most feasible option at this moment, but there's lots of concern about second and third order effects, side effects we may not understand. So I think we need to be careful here, but this is an area where we really ought to be promoting international cooperation. We ought to be fostering some rules of the road. We ought to be working closely with the Chinese, because I think this is an area that we are going to have to get into, but we need to do it carefully and after looking very hard at particularly the second order effects on, for instance, the ozone layer or other things we care about. Well,
I mean, one of those things from what I read in Colbert's book is it has to be done over and over and over. It's not just a one-shot project. And if you decide to reverse it and you stop doing it, all that heat comes tumbling right back down on us. It hasn't dissipated somewhere out there.
Yeah, we learned from Mount Pinatubo that it takes about 6 months, about 2 months for the particles to get into the stratosphere, and then they last for about 6 months. So there was an effect of Mount Pinatubo. We've been using some of the national laboratories, the DOE national laboratories have been looking at Pinatubo and as a sort of test case of what happens when those particulates get sprayed into the stratosphere.
Is it possible that one nation or one group of nations might just decide to do this and not consult very much with the rest of the world, maybe make some phone calls 2 hours beforehand? Could that happen? You call for cooperation, but what if there really were no collaboration or cooperation or even consultation, just a phone call, here's what's coming?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's possible. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to be on the lookout for, find ways to, again, work collaboratively to monitor, to make sure there aren't these rogue operations. Now, one of the constraints is most of these techniques aren't limited in geographic area. They tend to affect wider areas. So the incentive, therefore, for people to do something on their own may be less if they know that anything they do is going to benefit or affect lots of people beyond them. Some of the techniques like growing algae fast might have more local effects, but and cloud brightening might have more local effects. But in general, these techniques are pretty widespread in effect, and therefore that probably does diminish the chances that someone will do something on the rogue.
What is cloud whitening? I
It's
don't know.
basically spraying water into clouds to make them brighter, make them whiter. And that presumably could have relatively local effects depending on where the clouds are.
And it deflects heat also.
So yeah, right. Same principle, trying to deflect heat, make sure it doesn't get to the Earth's surface.
Well, turning to demography, of course, that is in global trends of naturally. And we look ahead 20 years and we see that the median age in Japan will be 53. In France, Italy, Germany, about 47, not so different from 10 years ago. In South Africa, 22. But in Latin America, East Asia, slightly over 30, and these groups tend to love democracy, which means autocrats might expect some color revolutions like the Orange Revolution in Ukraine or the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Do you think we could expect that sort of thing among our friends in Latin America, our neighbors, your neighbors and mine in California and Texas?
Let us hope so. I think so. I mean, we as you say, young people tend to be more interested maybe in democracy, though we've seen in the United States, young cohorts are less interested in democracy because they haven't seen much. They've only seen gridlock and dysfunction in most of their adult lives. So it's a good question, I think. But having seen autocracy, it may well be that the younger folks in Latin America, places we care about, will turn more to democratic forms, be more interested in democracy. Let us hope so. On the demographic front, the biggest news, of course, is China, which is about to fall off the demographic cliff. Its workforce peaked in 2015. So it faces the challenge. And I think this explains a lot of what President Xi does. He's in a hurry to try and make China rich before it gets old. Unlike Japan or Europe, China is getting old when it's still poor in per capita terms. And so I think that urgency is one of the things that really animates President Xi.
Well, it brings us to some of the scenarios. There are about 6 in this report. Fascinating. I mean, one of them is we all live happily ever after in the democracies. People from scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs from Russia and China are flocking to Europe and flocking to the United States because they can't innovate where they live, too much monitoring, too many repressive rules. And I'm assuming that climate change is dealt with. A couple of the scenarios deal with the US and China, an intense competition that ignores climate change, which continues to rage. These look pretty likely to me. We can come to the others, but where would you settle on the China-US competition question?
Yeah, I think the scenario in this latest version that comes closest to my bet would be what they call competitive coexistence, really loose blocks of countries around the United States and China. I think of them as kind of clubs, not alliances, but clubs with some interpenetration of the clubs and no fixed memberships necessarily, some fence sitting, some hedging, with powerful economic ties across the club. I worry about the current tendency to talk about a new Cold War between the United States and China. I think that's a very unhelpful description. This is not a Cold War. We are entangled economically with China in ways that very different from our relations with Russia. And I think most important, if we are going to save the planet through the climate crisis, we're going to have to work with the Chinese. It's an imperative. So I hope we get to something like competitive coexistence, where we're competing to be sure, but recognizing that on a set of issues from climate change to pandemics and even beyond, proliferation perhaps, we have powerful common interests with the Chinese and need to work closely with them.
And we're all living in the year of the tiger.
Yes, yes.
So, of course, there is one scenario that would have the United States, Europe, Russia, and China each living pretty much in its own part of the world, in its own way of thinking. And what jumped out at me was self-sufficiency. I don't hear anybody talk about self-sufficiency out of North Korea. They seem to be looking at virtues and necessities. But does this mean we're going to see more countries trying to replace their imports with things they make at home? And what would that mean for the world economy?
I think there will be a certain tendency. We've seen that already after the pandemic. All the supply chain shocks we saw made people think that they need to do some changing. My guess is there'll be less of that than we might expect. I mean, China is just too important in the global economy. Too much stuff is done and made there. So while I think supply chains will shorten, and people will tend to say, well, better do it in Mexico than China, perhaps, maybe even do it in the United States. Some manufacturing that we've seen, much manufacturing has come back to the United States over the last 10 years, though not with many jobs. It hasn't brought jobs with it because it's been automated. But so I think there will be a considerable effect of trying to be more self-reliant, but there are really strong limits, I think, on how far that will actually go.
You're right. We do have more happily employed robots.
Right,
There are a
right.
couple of really doomsday scenarios. One is chaos, lack of direction, volatility, terrible climate change, of course. And then there is the catastrophic food situation that is the last scenario that is imagined. Terrible loss of food because of climate change. And who puts Humpty Dumpty back together again? The EU and China. Very
Right.
interesting. The US isn't mentioned. They help the poverty-ridden nations get back on their feet. They do something about climate change, and everybody goes happily into the sunset. But where is the US in all of this? I mean, this report was written by Americans. Why did they leave us out?
Well, I think it's a big question. If I was going to say, what are the two biggest uncertainties about the future? One has to do with China and one has to do with us. Really big question of where we're going. Can we make the kind of renewal we need, but find hard to do? The irony, of course, is that the same parallelization, the same gridlock and dysfunction that we'd like to fix can't be fixed because of the gridlock and dysfunction. We seem to be stuck in what I now think of as a kind of executive-judicial system, right? Where we have an executive and a judiciary, but not much by way of a Congress that functions. So I think there really are, unfortunately, very big doubts about our own role in the future. Obviously, the Biden administration is trying hard to restore an image of leadership and competence, and has had some successes. But the world knows, having seen us go back and forth before, that we might do it again. So I think there really is a big uncertainty. And one of the things I would underscore, had I been doing this global trends, was that big uncertainty about the United States and its role in the future, unfortunately.
Well, then I can't resist bringing up an op-ed piece that you and your wife, Karen Treverton, wrote at the end of last year. And in it, you pointed out that when you were putting together the report of 2017, presiding over that effort, and this must have been in 2015, 2016, you could see trouble coming that we now identify as civil war, whatever that turns out to be. And as I read your op-ed, I think you're not looking for a third battle of Manassas in Virginia. Just as well, 1 and 2 didn't go that well for the Union. However, you did see a battle between lawyers and secessionists coming that could eventually result in a much looser federation, the sort that the founding fathers had in mind in 1789. How would that federation work?
Probably not very well. As you say, when I started the global trends that came out in 2017, I had a conversation, maybe 2015, that time frame, with a colleague, and he said, if you're looking out 20 years, don't you really need to take the red-blue divide in the United States seriously? And I said, well, I think we are. And he said, no, I mean, isn't there some chance in 20 years, don't you have to reckon with the chance that the country will physically come apart? So that's been kind of my watchword ever since. And physical separation wouldn't be easy because we know there are big blue cities like Austin in very red places like Texas, and Orange County, a red spot in blue state California. So the physical separation isn't, it seems to me, very likely, and we're certainly not going to have more battles of Manassas. But it does seem to me that we're already, as we watch the abortion debate, we're basically moving toward a kind of federation in which people not only make decisions about where to live based on jobs and other things, but maybe based on the laws that will govern them in particular states. We're obviously going that way already on abortion, but you can imagine it happening on other issues as well. So what I imagine is a kind of a pretty untidy and much looser federation in which even relatively basic laws may differ. Guns, abortion, other things differ from state to state. And then the question would be, what would be the residual powers of a central government? And that would, it seems to me, be something very much up for grabs. The other alternative, unfortunately, to imagine is us sort of slipping into something like the Brazilian or Filipino pattern, where we get periodic strongmen, then a period of chaos or gridlock, and another strongman. So it's unfortunately it's all too imaginable, and it does seem to be something that we really have to take into account.
Well, you mentioned what will be left at the center, at the central government, and it makes me think of the European Union and wonder, would this be a security problem for us if the central government can't get together a response to a foreign policy emergency quickly enough to respond effectively?
Yeah, so far the main thing that Americans seem to be able to agree on is defense spending, right? That's the one thing we do well. So whether
we all benefit.
Yes. So,
I've got Lockheed Martin right down the street here in Dallas-Fort Worth.
Right. Yeah. So presumably defense would continue to be a unifying principle, but how far that could go, and presumably foreign affairs would also be something that the Confederation or Federation did. We do have a kind of experiment in front of us, since the common market is now, the European Union is really now, it seems to me, moving to a much looser, not much, but moving in a loosening direction, with more power devolving back to the nation states from the center. So in some sense, we may have a vision of the future as we look to Europe.
Well, you point out that this is already happening, and it is. People are moving from your state, California, to mine, Texas, and they have always moved because they like our tax laws better than yours if they're in business. But I have met some of they're pricing up the houses like crazy. There are no houses available. They're going at enormous prices to your Californians, but they are also moving for what they call cultural values, conservative values, education and crime particularly. But then I also met a young woman who wants to move to the West Coast to get away from the guns of Texas. She worries about her kids going to school and who might show up and start firing a weapon. So it's already happening.
Yeah, you do run into, surprisingly often, I've run into people who say, I just don't want to live with these people, right? And we see the divide in all kinds of ways, from income to geography. You look at the differences between the blue counties in 2020 and the red counties, they're enormous. It's just an enormous difference. And there is some geographical basis to it. It's just not a very tidy geographical basis between the blue and red.
Yeah. Well, we do hope for questions on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we have one from a fellow board member, Lee Gunn. Could Dr. Treverton comment on the overall effect of climate change on relations between and among governments?
Gosh, do we have dinner plans? That's a big question.
It is a big question, but he always asks big questions.
We'll certainly have big effects. Most of the effects for the foreseeable future will be kind of second order for us. That is, there'll be effects on our friends, on migration patterns. We already know that many of the conflicts that happen, for instance, Darfur, was essentially about water. So we're going to see more and more of that kind of conflict as people have to move from where they are to some other place where they may not be welcome or they may not be sustainable. So we'll see a lot of that. As sea level rises, my line is people don't wait to move, don't wait to get their feet wet before they move. So we'll see lots of population movement. Many of the lowest lying islands in the world are in the Caribbean, so that'll affect us relatively directly. But a place like Bangladesh, which has done surprisingly well and has been very good at harboring refugees, it has obviously enormous problems as sea level rises there. But we've seen, I think that's one of the things that's struck us, that the effects of the climate crisis have hit us earlier and more and harder than most of us expected, I think. As you know, we can't attribute every bad storm to climate change, but we do expect much more volatile weather. The droughts do seem to be increasing. We've seen already part of the Central American problem is the bad drought in Guatemala, which is forcing people to leave the land. So we're going to see lots of manifestations, I think, mostly, as I say, second order first, but increasingly they're going to affect us. And if we imagine now there's concern about the permafrost, and if we have a significant melting of the permafrost, that I think is calculated to have twice as much carbon as is already in the atmosphere. So it'll be an enormous problem. So I think we will have both lots of things to deal with that we just have to deal with, but we're also going to have some unexpected, and as the global trend suggested, maybe a major climate crisis will push us to some new forms of collaboration.
Well, in terms of migration, there will be enormous numbers of people coming to this country and other countries as well. And you can't send them home. They can't go home again. There is no home left.
Right.
So,
right.
I guess governments will have to find a way to accommodate and absorb new populations.
Well, I think they will. I think they will. And we, as we know, in general, overall migration is a great net benefit to the United States. It's not perceived that way everywhere by everyone, but overall, one has to say there are some local effects maybe on local budgets and local welfare systems. There may be, but not very much. There may be some displacement effect with taking jobs from people who are already here, but we don't see much of that basically when we look hard at the numbers. What we see is 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley have been done by Asians or Asian Americans. We see enormous creativity. And so getting our immigration right, I think, is important because it's the one thing we have going for us. Our demographics will get worse and worse and worse. Much of the increase in US population has been immigration, and it's been a great boon for us, but it does mean serious adjustments. What we saw in Europe after 2015 was something that we knew was going to happen. We just didn't expect it to happen so quickly over a couple of summers. And obviously Europe needs people. Its demographics are bad as well. So it needs people. And we knew that most of the people that were going to come from North Africa and Africa, we just didn't expect them to come so quickly. And that raised both the adjustment problem, which on the whole, the biggest receiver, Germany, has handled really quite well. But we knew there were going to be adjustment problems. Unfortunately, we also had the kind of backlash that got reflected in Brexit and other anti-immigration movements in Europe.
Well, certainly makes sense. We also have a question from Austin Hudgens. How best can America leverage our strong business community in advancing democracy? Can you speak more to the future of public-private partnerships? Thank you.
Great. Well, I wish I had a crystal ball. As I say, I see the need for those partnerships. I hope that business will be much more aggressive in pursuing those kinds of partnerships. But there have been interesting straws in the wind. A couple of years ago, the Business Roundtable talked about broadening the basis from shareholders to stakeholders, including employees and presumably customers, which seem to be the beginnings of a kind of sea change in thinking about public and private. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have been followed up by very much, and we see occasional straws in the wind with particular companies saying they're not going to do this or that because of some anti-democratic move. I hope we see much more of that. Now, we understand that companies are in business to make money, but they also need to care about their reputation and the places they live in. I hope there'll be very dramatically new forms. It seems to me, for better or worse, that given our gridlock, we're not going to solve many of our problems in the old-fashioned way with government programs. We're going to have to find, it seems to me, new ways to harness the huge fortunes that are being made to public purposes as well. The cyber world is a perfect example where we have something that's a huge public interest. We have to care about all those infrastructures that are carried through the ether, but they're all in private hands. And so somehow we need to, it seems to me that's a problem that of a scale that makes it almost new in kind. We're used to public-private overlaps. We've done a lot in the past, but this is one where we have a huge public interest that's entirely in private hands, and how we work out that sort of interface and connection, I think could be, I hope, a model for how we think about public-private, what we've traditionally thought of as public-private, in a broader way.
It occurs to me that we might see great foundations taking on some of this role. I mean, for example, public health seems to me to have some problems now, the CDC particularly, a little shaky there. I mean, suppose we had a RAND Corporation for Public Health with that kind of funding, expertise, and prestige that could issue guidelines. You don't have to follow them, but here's what they think best. Here's the science they have developed. Can you imagine that kind of thing in that or other areas?
I think so. I think so. What we've seen so far is this generation of rich people has not been particularly good at philanthropy, not been particularly generous. We hope they get more generous. But it is true that the Gates Foundation spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization. So already that scrambles how we think about public and private, right? Here's a private institution that's probably more important than the World Health Organization. I sometimes think Google's probably more important as an international actor than, say, Spain, or pick your country. So there is these enormous forces, geopolitical forces, but also economic forces. And I think if there's some precedent before in the sort of 40 years before the World Health Organization was created, essentially the Rockefeller Foundation functioned like a World Health Organization. It had offices in lots of different places around the world. It provided technical assistance primarily to try and build public health structures. So there is some precedent for this. I think that does seem to me to be a promising direction.
You wrote a book in 2014, I think, called Dividing the Divided States. It was about Sudan and other similar situations in Europe and Asia. Do you anticipate more states dividing? And of course, then you say what has to be considered is security, citizenship, oil and water, naturally oil and water.
Yeah, I think there will be some more of that. Probably not wholesale, but some of it. In a funny way, when you think about Europe, with the EU, then regions of Britain like Scotland don't necessarily need Britain, right? So you can imagine they could get along positively fine without Britain. So there'll be some of that in richer places, I think. And there's bound to be some secessionist movements in poorer countries as well, as we've seen all the horror in Ethiopia going on. So I think there will be more of that. And one of the things, unfortunately, that we did that book about Sudan because given that thou shalt not change African borders rule, nobody was doing very much. So we put together some foundations, got together and started to sort of track 2 or track 1.5 diplomacy to try and think about the implications of South Sudan becoming independent. And we did look at precedents across migration, water, assets. Sadly, that separation hasn't turned out very well, but it was at least worth trying to think about and prepare for.
Well, now Czechoslovakia did manage to separate into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That seemed to work after the Iron Curtain came down.
Yeah, I think if you look back, one of the great successes that we wouldn't necessarily predicted was that the end of the Soviet Empire happened without much violence. All those countries became independent. It also happened without, we worried a lot about loose nukes wandering around. That by and large didn't happen. So when you look back, you have to say, well, what was something that we might not have expected to go so well? We're always looking for dire outcomes or dire possibilities because we have to worry about those. But if you look backward, it seems to be one of the breakup of the Soviet Union has to count as one of the more successful. Mr. Putin wouldn't see it that way, but must at least the process has to be credited as being one of the more successful international events of the last 50 years.
And I guess you've noted, as I have, that Putin has built up enormous reserves, $631 billion, but he's not holding them in dollars. He's doing euros, he's doing renminbi and gold. I didn't see anything about currencies in the Global Trends report. It may be there and I missed it, but does this presage something, this move away from dollars on the part of President Putin?
I think so. I mean, we've seen, and unfortunately, one of the side effects of sanctions, we've gotten rather sanctions happy and gotten pretty good at applying them lately. But one of the side effects is it does push people to find alternatives. We saw after the United States pulled out of the agreement with Iran, The Europeans wanted not to have sanctions bite on Iran, so they tried to find alternative ways of getting funding to Iran. Couldn't do it then, but we'll find ways. And I think Mr. Putin's holding of different currencies as reserves is a kind of sign of the future. The Chinese are working hard to try and make their currency important or make themselves important in international banking. And if we were to, as part of sanctions against Putin, if he does something, which I don't think he will in Ukraine, but if we did and we kicked Russia out of SWIFT, the international banking transfer mechanisms, that would only hasten, I think, the search for alternatives and probably alternatives to the dollar as well. So I think that's out there. That is part of our future.
Here is a question from Jeffrey Dorian. Could a carbon fee incentivize investment in the private sector, and coupled with a border adjustment or tariff to motivate China and other countries? Of course, there should be some funds returned to low-income citizens. What do you think?
I'm all for those things. I think a carbon fee is the most, a carbon tax is the most efficient way to try and reduce emissions. And you could do things to make sure that it doesn't hurt low-income people in the process and is fair. So there are lots of different mechanisms. Cap and trade is another one that will work okay as well. That'll be harder to harmonize with countries like Europe that have tax systems rather than cap and trade. But there are lots of mechanisms out there. What we don't have so far is the will to do it, basically. There are plenty of good mechanisms, things we can do. We know how to do this. It's just we're not yet ready to do it. And that is the big challenge, I think, confronting us.
And here is a question from Patrick Costello, the president of the American Security Project. Given the long time horizon considered with the report, how is Global Trends supposed to help guide policymakers today, as much of their bandwidth is occupied trying to deal with the crisis of the moment?
Yeah, so it was a good question, as we say.
First of all, which crisis of the moment would you like to address?
Well, let me talk about the longer time horizon first. I didn't get to do a Global Trends when I was vice chair of the DEC back in the 1990s, but I did play some role in conceiving the idea. And I regarded the fact that it was going to be unclassified as a great benefit. You know, if you're looking out 5 years, and certainly if you're looking out 20, none of that classified stuff on your computer helps very much. So it was going to be unclassified. But I realized that if we had given our policy counterparts a long document that looked out 20 years but was classified, they would have said, "Oh, thanks a lot. That's terrific. I'll really look forward to it." Never would have opened it, right? Never. The immediate would have driven out the longer term. But I knew that if we got some press, then they would turn to their special assistants and say, "What the devil is the Nick up to? What is this?" And that's worked wonderfully well. I released the 2017 version at a day-long series of events at the museum in Washington, which is unhappily now defunct, but was a great opportunity to get some press. So I think of the purpose of the 20-year look mostly to open people's imaginations or imaginings a bit, to help them think about longer-term possibilities, things that are maybe not likely, but very consequential. But it is true, and I think one of my RAND colleagues used to say that if longer-term thinking doesn't help me with what I do today, it's just entertainment. And I think that is a fair critique. But it is important to recognize the timeline of all these things. If we think about Mr. Putin's timeline about Ukraine, it probably runs back to 900, right, to the origins of Kievan Russia more than 1,000 years ago. So thinking, at least in a time stream, seems to me to be very important. It's also, if you look out 20 years, then you need to, it seems to me, take into account some discontinuities. I finished a book on intelligence just before 9/11. It came out after 9/11, but when I finished the book, I was aware that I had sort of a rosy globalization view of the future. In late 1990s, globalization, we were aware of the bad sides, but it looked pretty good. And I was aware that I had sort of a rosy globalization view. So I asked myself what might knock that off course. I came up with two possibilities, neither rocket science. One was a major terrorist attack on the United States, The other was a major global recession. Now, I didn't expect to be 2 for 2, and I certainly didn't want to be 2 for 2, but it reminded me that particularly looking out 20 years, you need to take into account those maybe low probability but high consequence events.
This is from Lindsay Iverson, who's an adjunct senior fellow at the American Security Project. Can you expand on how you think the pandemic has altered the trends outlined in the most recent GT report? We've seen it lead to both vaccine nationalism and closed borders, as well as unprecedented public investment in scientific cooperation. How do these trends add up to you?
I think mostly what happened is the pandemic tended to accentuate things that were already going on. So, the competition between the United States and China intensified because of the pandemic. The tendency for countries to go their own way also intensified. We saw a period when the European countries were denying medical supplies to each other, even though they were members of the Union. We saw the disconnect between citizens and their government. I think that grew. So far, it seems to me that the great success is really the rapid production of vaccines. Now, unfortunately, the rapid production hasn't been accompanied by as rapid a diffusion, particularly into the poor countries. We worry a lot about our own country, but has not to the poor countries. And that does seem to me to be a real failure of international collaboration. I saw an IMF, I think it was, estimate that said for $50 billion, we could put a shot in the arm of everybody on the planet. The fact that we aren't having such an effort seems to me to be a great failure of international cooperation. I'd hoped that the pandemic would lead to new ideas, new forms of collaboration, again, across public and private. And so far, with the exception of the vaccine production, which was basically a government venture, we took the risk, we taxpayers took the risk. And there was pretty good collaboration across the pharmaceutical industry. That seems to me to be so far, sadly, the main visible cooperative effort. I hope we do better.
Okay, we need to do better. What are the 2 or 3 things you can think of? We're entering our 3rd year of the pandemic, may as well admit that and face up to it. Surely distribution can improve for these vaccines. How do we do that?
Yeah, I'd hope that we put together a kind of a summit and get people to get the South Africans and the Koreans and others to serve as sort of focal points. We ought to make sure that the patents don't prevent people from producing these drugs, since after all, we taxpayers mostly paid for them. So it seems to me that kind of a program ought to happen, looking at kind of focal points around the world. And even Brazil is doing better than we are at vaccinating people. They've had their own troubles, and Bolsonaro has been a very loose cannon, but even they've been doing better. So trying to put together, it seems to me, those places, an agglomeration, a grouping of those places that are interested in doing well would be very sensible. And maybe they could also serve as focal points for manufacturing as well.
Well, there is some manufacturing taking place in South Africa, isn't there now?
There is, yeah.
But we need more.
I think we need more and more places doing it. And that means opening up the patents, which should have been open, in my view, quite a long time ago, since we taxpayers basically did pay for them.
Very good point. Well, Dr. Greg Treverton, go back to your 80-degree day in Pacific Palisades and try to cheer yourself up. Thank you so much. You've given us a wonderful 45 minutes and look forward to next time.
Thanks a lot, Lee. Great to see you and great to be with you.
I'm with you.